project.
I get everybody's attention,
That's
please.
what I did for my doctorate. Okay, so you're going to
I'm Eric Hodges.
Yeah.
I am a professor of political
Yeah,
science
but
at
you're
Longwood
not
University. I'm also a former Marine.
my doctorate too.
And I'm going to be
Okay,
moderating our first afternoon panel this afternoon, which is about health-related approaches to veterans resilience.
Okay.
So we have 4 presentations. We have Carrie Carter from North Carolina State
No.
and William Howe, who are both going to be looking at COVID-19 and veterans resilience in the realm of COVID. We have Cheryl, who is coming from Florida Atlantic University. She's going to be talking about her project, Operation Red, White, and Blue. And then Rebecca Ivory from Delaware is going to be talking about her work with Special Forces veterans. Each presenter is going to have 15 minutes, and we're going to hold the Q&A until the end of all the presentations this time. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carrie.
That's me. Well, hello everyone. I hope that lunch was good. I know it was much needed for me. My presentation today is titled Just Another Battle Drill, a critical analysis of veteran reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. Like I said, my name is Carrie Carter. I am doing this work with Jessica Strong. A little bit of background on the project. So I am a senior research consultant for Blue Star Families. We are a military research and advocacy nonprofit committed to strengthening military families, active and veteran, by connecting them with their neighbors. These are individuals and organizations to create vibrant communities of mutual support. I think we've heard a lot over the last day and a half about how important community, sense of belonging, and connectedness is for veterans, and that's what we try to achieve at Blue Star Families. I am a sociology PhD student. I study military life. I also have a higher education background in career services. That's where I got my start in the veteran studies space, working with student veterans. And I'm also an Army spouse. So the purpose of this study, as we were conducting our regular annual research about military families and their lives and their issues, we realized that the COVID pandemic was happening and we needed to get ahead of it. We, as I'll talk about in a second, started a couple of projects looking at specifically how active duty and veteran families, service members and family members were responding to the pandemic. And we knew as we were collecting this data, going back to the literature, that veterans are resilient and adaptable. We knew this from our literature, we knew it from our personal experiences. We know that they're resilient and adaptable during and after service. What we didn't know as much about from the literature was how veterans, armed with their military experience, were processing distressing life events, and particularly the COVID-19 pandemic. So we used an interpretive qualitative case study design with the goal of understanding how did veterans navigate the pandemic overall, and what influence, if any, did their prior military service have on their resilience. So the case of the COVID-19 pandemic is particularly useful in this context because many of the pandemic challenges are also common military life stressors. Every year at Blue Star Families, we do an annual military family lifestyle survey where we ask the question, what's going on in life? This is with active duty families I have here up on the screen, but we ask veterans as well. What are your top issues that you're experiencing? Military spouse employment, amount of time away from family, and dependent children's education are always top themes. Those are the same things we were dealing with during the pandemic, right? And I know this is not news for you. Time away from family, activity restrictions, disruptions to education and employment. So the COVID-19 pandemic actually presented a really useful case for analyzing how prior exposure to these types of challenges through military life experience might influence the process of resilience. And so for our theoretical framework, we used a critical resilience theory. I'm a sociologist, so I often look at structural solutions to issues. And this particular theory, this critical resilience theory, is distinct from a trait approach. So not like some of us have resilience and some of us don't have resilience, the haves and the have-nots, but rather resilience is the process of mobilizing resources to navigate stress. Those resources can be social, cultural, and economic. This is really well aligned with our mission at Blue Star Families about, again, connecting people in communities to access those resources. And it's also useful for identifying one of the guiding questions for this conference, which is what lessons can we learn from our military community members about how civilian communities can be resilient as well. We also adopted the IASO community cultural wealth theory to think about how veterans as a marginalized population use an array of knowledge, skills, strengths, and experiences that are learned and shared by people in their community. This is an asset-based approach as opposed to deficit perspective we've been talking about a lot. And this is, kind of in defense of this theory of capital that we often hear as applied to those people who have it and those people who don't have it, and trying to help those people who don't have capital get the capital so they can succeed in an environment where maybe they're not set up to succeed all the time. So this is really focused at looking at unrecognized and unacknowledged strengths that would be intrinsic, in this case, to the military community. This is typically a framework which is applied to racial and ethnic minority groups, but it has been applied in very recent research by Hunt, Lim, and Williams to the military population. I think it's fitting, but it could use a little bit more work. That's what we're going to talk about here today. There's 6 types of capital involved in this community cultural wealth. That is what military people bring to their life experience as a result of their military identity and service to navigate challenges. Those are aspirational capital, familial capital, resistant capital, linguistic capital, navigational capital, and social capital as we understand it. So why this matters, I have to bring up Tom Brady. And for those of you who might not have seen this in public online discourse, Tom Brady made a comment about the NFL season being like a military deployment. There have been a lot of emotional reactions on the internet from veterans and members of the military community arguing that this is an oversimplification, this is ridiculous. Some people saying we're making too big of a deal out of this, but either way, however you feel about Tom Brady and what he said, this instance reflects that there are large gaps in understanding about military life experiences between civilians and military-connected people. And as I've discussed with this theory of critical resilience, we need for military-affiliated people in their communities to be able to access these resources to facilitate the resilience process. So when there are these gaps in understanding, when there are these stereotypes, just flat-out wrong perceptions about things that are experienced in the military, that impacts military-affiliated people being able to access these resources that many of us facilitate. So the sample for this interpretive qualitative case study came from 2 surveys of active duty and veteran family members, and these are specifically about experiences during the start of the pandemic. So the first one is how I got started working with Blue Star families. That was the pain points poll. It was a weekly poll. We did it every week about what pain points are you experiencing during the pandemic. So as soon as everything shut down, we were like, we got to ask people about this. And we asked this open-ended question, please tell us more about what has been most helpful in managing your physical and emotional health during this crisis. We had 67 veteran respondents answer that open-ended question. These are all optional in our surveys. And the second study was called the REST study, Resilience Under Stress. So we realized resilience was going to be really key to this conversation right at the beginning of the pandemic. And we asked as an open-ended question in that survey, hey, tell us, how's COVID impacting you? Good, bad, or other? We had 250 veteran respondents answer that question. And 300 or so might not sound like too many, but let me tell you, these are robust. There's a lot of feelings and things going on in these responses, and we'll get into it. This is a little bit about the sample. Pretty consistent for most of our research around veterans. Of note here is that 76% of the veteran respondents are female. So, that should be used as we contextualize these findings. Also to note, most of the respondents are white. Most of them are 60 years or older. So thinking about the COVID pandemic and just what we already know about immunocompromised people, elderly people, the family context, be thinking about that as we review the findings. Pretty good service branch representation. This is pretty consistent with what we see with our research. I hate that we weren't able to do intersectional analysis. We just didn't have enough respondents. That would be really helpful for us to do in the future. If anybody's interested, let's work on it. Okay, so these are our methods. I won't bore you with it. It's all grounded in critical resilience theory. We started with a deductive process, looking at just what are those physical, emotional, mental health impacts of the pandemic. Many of them will not be surprising to you. And then we went back and said, okay, they had these resources they were accessing to help them with their resilience process during the pandemic, but there was something bigger than that, something that helped them access these resources maybe differently than civilians, or perhaps seemed to us to be unique to the military experience, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. So I want to make sure to say, as we're talking about the pandemic, even though we're talking about resilience, obviously the pandemic was very challenging. There were many impacts, like civilians, that veteran respondents experienced. Business concerns associated with lockdown, mental health, social isolation. I've tried to include some of the narratives here to contextualize these things for you, but as you might expect, there were challenges. There were also resources, though, that were used in the process of resilience that really mattered for veterans and their resilience process. These were, as again, you might expect, family and friends. That was the number one thing people told us in terms of resources that were used during the pandemic. In particular, as you can see in this photo, our veteran respondents were adept at interacting with people from afar. If they were physically distant, they were still able to access that resource of family and friends because they had done it before. Hobbies, yard work, house projects, these things were talked about a lot. Military benefits was also discussed quite a bit. If people had military retirement, they felt like they were relatively insulated from the financial considerations of the pandemic and how that might have impacted others who were not military affiliated. People enjoyed using installation services. They perceived those as perhaps safer in some cases or better stocked. But again, civilians have access to many of these resources. So what is unique about how veterans access them, if at all? And this is where I wanted to introduce this concept of military cultural wealth, which is that to access these resources, respondents leveraged specific knowledge, skills, strengths, and experiences shared by military community members. So I'm up here saying this, but I didn't come up with it. Our respondents said that. Over and over again, they said, my military experience has prepared me. None of this is harder than deploying with the service. I'm used to dealing with stress. As a veteran, I don't think this is as bad for me as civilians. They said these things to us. And that's kind of what made us go back and revisit the responses to see what was going on in terms of how resources were accessed. So these are 3 types of capital from that community cultural wealth framework that were accessed by veteran respondents to help navigate the pandemic. The first is aspirational capital. I'm calling it hunt the good stuff here. Apologies for some Army-related metaphors and idioms. But this is the idea of maintaining hope in the face of adversity. This has come up a lot over the last day and a half. Looking forward to the future, as you can see the respondent in the top right says, waiting for the good times. The second type of capital already existing in the framework is this familial capital, kind of a people-first mentality that respondents really valued family time. Many of them said they had been separated during their military service quite a bit, and they were happy to be at home with their family. Not everyone, as we'll see in a second, but many people did. And this kind of collectivist mindset was a big piece as well. I know we've talked a lot about unit cohesion, family. So the family in this case extended beyond just immediate family members, but the people within those individuals' networks. And then social capital, as distinct from familial capital, was, taking advantage of, which sounds like a negative thing, but really is a positive thing in the side of the veteran, taking advantage of the resources within one's community and also helping those in that community prop themselves up. So you can see this particular response in the bottom right corner came in that pain points poll week 3. So like 3 weeks into the pandemic, this person said she and her community had made 1,350 face masks. Crazy, crazy volunteerism and involvement in community support that happened immediately upon impact of the pandemic as a result of this service orientation and this kind of got your six mentality. Something that is missing from the framework is what I would suggest we call adaptive capital. This has several components as I see it. The first is this understanding of the duality of hardship and advantages. So in this particular response, I've chosen this one. There were many, many more I could have used. You can see how the respondent balances the pros and cons of the pandemic. Look, I get more family time. Math still sucks. Sports have had a negative vibe and my electricity bill went up, but my mother-in-law lives down the road. I don't have to see her as much because of the pandemic. I get to sleep in, stay up late. Internet's always bogged down. It's this very interesting ability to balance these hardships and advantages because at the end of the day, these veteran respondents have been through this before, as we've discussed. They've been through hard times and they know there's good things and bad things that come from these circumstances. So that was part of the adaptation. Another piece is this idea of minimalism. So several of the respondents mentioned that despite disruptions to things in their daily lives, they could survive without. It was okay that they couldn't get their preferred fruits and vegetables because they've been there before. It's not going to kill them. We can get through this. And the third type of what I consider adaptive capital, or perhaps a component of this, is perspective taking. So while many respondents, again, talked about negative impacts, things that they were really struggling with, material issues, they also said, we have survived worse, and many others are not as fortunate. And that ability to perspective take and that adapt to the experiences of others and their own experiences was really key for these veterans in terms of accessing these resources that were important for them in their resilience process. So there's quite a few implications of this, and these are pretty consistent with Boost Our Family's research implications overall because of our mission. First, increasing access to volunteer opportunities in local communities is really important for strengthening these military and civilian connections that allow for more shared understanding. It also gives purpose to veterans as they can share, hey, look, I've been through this before. Yeah, it really sucks. Here's my strategy. This is my mindset. It's helpful. Also promoting community recreation. It wasn't something I talked about too much in hobbies, but a lot of people said they used outdoor parks. They did a lot of virtual exercise. Physical activity in their communities was key for them. And then expanding flexible work and learning policies with employers and schools to foster that family time. Many people talked about how having flexible options with work gave them the ability to access that familial capital, to access that social resource that helped with them being resilient. And from a research perspective, several recent studies, particularly in the higher education literature, has looked at veterans in a critical lens, veteran critical theory, and the idea that military cultural capital is a unique thing. It includes unique knowledge, skills, strengths, and experiences. We spend a lot of time talking about all of the things that we want veterans to gain and perspectives that we wish they had, but we spend very little time in the literature talking overall in a robust and concise way about all of the amazing things that veterans bring to the table in their lives. Specifically, within that conversation, this literature would really benefit from looking at how holding intersecting marginalized identities affects the deployment of adaptive capital. So as I said, this theoretical framework, YASO's community cultural wealth, is intended for initially racial and ethnic minority groups. And so thinking about how perhaps racial and ethnic minority veterans are having either a greater time using adaptive capital or more challenges would be really critical to the conversation. I would be happy to connect with you and talk with you more about this. This is my contact information. Happy to take questions at the end, and tons of references. Thank you.
Okay, so our next presentation is going to be from William Howe from Texas Tech University. He's also going to be talking about COVID. So I guess it's this one.
Great, hello. So good to be here. My name is William Howe. I'm Assistant Professor of Organizational Communication at Texas Tech University. I'm also a Army veteran, so that's kind of what drew me into this, and also paid for all my education to get that PhD. So I'm thankful for the GI Bill and all that came with it. So today I'll be talking about veteran resilience during COVID-19. I have a co-author, Dr. Arden Roeder. Unfortunately, she's unable to be here because she's expecting her second child. So, but she sends her best wishes, and she wishes she could be here. So with that, we'll get into the rationale behind this study. So military organizations are high reliability organizations. So in case you haven't heard of what a high reliability organization is, a high reliability organization is an organization that operates in a risky environment where lives are on the line, according to Roeder et al. 2020. HROs are known for having few accidents. So HRO theory was developed in response to normal accident theory, which said that accidents should be considered normal in the workplace and we should just prepare for accidents to happen. And then when accidents do happen, we should be able to respond to them. But the researchers, Wyke and Sutcliffe, spent a lot of time actually on aircraft carriers and noticed that with all the intricacies of an aircraft carrier, there were very few accidents happening. So they developed HRO theory and said, and according to several principles. Researchers have also found that HROs have a diffusion of resilience. So and this study that was done was with the National Weather Service forecasting team and comparing them to how they experienced a government shutdown. So during the government shutdown, they actually showed a great deal of resilience during the government shutdown, and the researchers hypothesized that the reason they showed a great deal of resilience was because they had been operating in an HRO and they had developed resilience through the HRO, and so that carried over into this life disruption. So HROs operate on 5 basic principles. If you've read any of the literature, this is kind of the foundations of HRO theory. Preoccupation with failure, reluctance to simplify, sensitivity to operations, commitment to resilience, and deference to expertise. So again, as we think through these, you can probably think of times in the military for those that have served or for those that are family members, when you've heard people talk, your family members talk about where the military overcomplicates things for some reason or another, but it's usually to abide by one of these principles. And my favorite principle to talk about is deference to expertise, which is what I was working on with my dissertation data. And I use the example of I was just a combat medic. I was an E3 when I was sent to Iraq, and one of my lieutenants was shot in the legs. And I had a major trying to tell me to move him, and I was like, no, we don't need to move him. We need to wait for the helicopter to come. And I became the senior medical personnel on the ground whose voice they had to listen to. So I'm telling, somebody of much higher superior than me, kind of off a little bit because I'm the senior medical personnel on the ground looking after. So you can see how those principles play a part in military operations. And commitment to resilience is one of that is called out, and I call it out here, because commitment to resilience has been linked to diffusion of resilience, again by Roeder et al. In that investigation of weather forecasting teams. So the idea, much as what was mentioned in the previous presentation, is that if you're exposed to trying scenarios, then you will build up a resilience, and you'll build up a diffusion of resilience where not only it applies in combat situations or in just mission situations or in your military service, but it could apply to other situations as well. So communication theory of resilience is what we use as a frame to look at resilience, because there's a ton of different definitions of what resilience is and how it's enacted. And so being a communication scholar, I turned to communication theory of resilience, which says that these 5 anchor points are what we look at to consider someone resilient. 1 is crafting normalcy, 2 is affirming identity anchors, 3 is maintaining using communication networks, 4 is constructing alternative logics, and 5 is foregrounding productive action. So each of these, and from a communication standpoint, can work to build resilience or demonstrate that resilience has occurred. So considering diffusion of resilience, we hypothesized that military veterans would score higher than civilians in each process. But how do we come to that hypothesis? Well, study 1 that I'll talk about is an accidental study. Even though I'm talking somewhat against normal accident theory with HRO, this was an accidental study. I was doing my dissertation from 2019 to 2020. So in the middle of my collection of my dissertation data, COVID-19 hit, and I had started collection in January, and then obviously in March, COVID hit, and so I was still collecting data through April to analyze in May to graduate on time, and had to look and see, well, did COVID cause something in my participants? Although I was not investigating resilience in my dissertation data, as I mentioned, I was investigating some other options, but nevertheless, I wanted to see if there was a difference in those who completed the survey before COVID-19 began and those who completed the survey after COVID-19, not ended, but after COVID-19 began. So the sample was 466 military veteran participants. And as you can see, mostly male, mostly white, and mostly from the United States Army. But you can see the rest of those statistics there. I ran in my dissertation data different analyses, and we could not find any significant differences between branches or between different ethnicities or sexual identifications, or college education status. So we didn't control for any variants. We just ran a MANOVA. And then you can see, as far as combat service, we did actually find one difference in that if somebody had deployed to a combat zone, they were actually scored significantly different, so we did include that as a covariate. For those of you that are inclined to ask about the statistics, I can answer any more questions later. So I split the sample by pre and post March 7th, which is the day the stock market crashed, and Americans really became more aware and cognizant of the coronavirus pandemic was going to be a major issue. And these MANOVA results revealed that the only variables that were significantly different between these two groups were the M2CQ and the UCLA loneliness scale. So the UCLA loneliness scale kind of speaks for itself with what it is, and it's measuring loneliness. The M2CQ, if you have not heard of that, that's the military to civilian questionnaire. And what that measures is in the last 30 days, how much difficulty have you had reintegrating to civilian society. So obviously, we want to see low scores on these scales because we want to see less loneliness and less difficulty reintegrating. But what we saw, interestingly, was the scores improved or decreased after March 7th. So when the coronavirus epidemic started and the stock market crashed, we actually saw a difference in how veterans responded before and after this March 7th date. And you can see the numbers there as to how much they differed by. So we theorized, after I talked over this data, I started thinking about it, and my first response was, well, when the COVID hit, I was obviously concerned about my dissertation, but part of me my family will call me a prepper. I like to say I'm just prepared, but while they were out running around trying to buy toilet paper, I was laughing at them from the comfort of my home with all of my stocks of food and supplies, and they did not think I was so much of a prepper then as prepared. But I thought that perhaps I felt in myself, at least, that I was able to enact some of my military identity. Some of my go bags actually came in useful for the first time in 10 years since I'd been out, and I was ready to go and move. I was in Norman, Oklahoma at the time, at the University of Oklahoma doing my PhD, so I was ready to get up into the mountains and get lost if I needed to. But and I theorized that maybe it's just possibly some other veterans felt the same way and felt that they were prepared for this scenario that a lot of Americans, the typical American, was not. So I began talking this theory over with other veterans who did express in my group that they had the same types of feelings. And so I theorized with Dr. Roeder that perhaps the diffusion of resilience may have played a role, and thus we began study 2. So in study 2, we hypothesized that veterans would score better than civilians on these different forms of resilience that we've already mentioned. We recruited a rather large sample again, and again we looked for, I'm not sure why the Army aid is bold, but it's distracting me, but anyways. We recruited this rather large sample, and we did not find any significant differences among these demographic factors. So again, we did not need to control for any covariates. Again, we had similar stats for the combat zone deployment service, but for exit was a little bit longer. So maybe that is needs to be considered when examining these factors I'm about to talk about. So we had significant results. So first we were like, yeah, this is what we were looking for. ANOVA results revealed the only variables that were significantly different, though, were between the two groups were maintaining using communication networks and constructing alternative logics. So of all the other ones, there was differences, but they were not statistically significant. However, when we drilled down and looked at the differences, we found that civilians actually scored better than veterans did. So we found that civilians actually scored better at maintaining and using communication networks, and civilians scored better at constructing alternative logics than veterans did, meaning that civilians were reporting that they were more resilient than veterans were in this time period, according to this quantitative data. So we're still examining other factors among the veteran sample to see if veterans who recently separated or were in a combat zone scored differently than veterans who did not. And these findings may suggest that diffusion of resilience is limited to a similar or familiar situation that was not the case with COVID-19. So since COVID-19 was so uniquely different from anything that may have been experienced during military service, perhaps that's why we did not see diffusion of resilience occur in this sample. But I'm more than welcome to listen to any other explanations you may have as to why we would see civilians scoring higher than veterans on these resilience scales. And with that, I yield the rest of my time to the other presenters. Thank you.
Can you take a picture from my coworker? When I'm just standing up there, so there's the camera, so whenever. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Our next presenter will be Cheryl Krause-Pereira from Florida Atlantic University. She'll be talking about Operation Red, White, and Blue. Did you want to just pull up the website? Or did you
No, the slide would be good, the slideshow.
Is it this one?
No. That's it. Okay, super. Well, hi everybody. It's nice to be here this afternoon, and I've been really enjoying all the talks, and this is my first time attending this conference, and I have to say that organizers did a wonderful job, so I appreciate being invited to actually do a presentation. And so my name is Cheryl Krause-Pereira. I am an Associate Dean for Research and Scholarship at Florida Atlantic University. And my colleague, Dr. Torres, couldn't make it to the presentation today, so I'm going to be presenting our work that we're doing together. I'm also the wife of a Marine veteran, so I'm really excited to be a part of this group. And I've kind of made it my life's work to engage with the veteran community and help them stay tethered to society and also help their families. So this is just a shout out, a welcome from Boca Raton, Florida. Our university is about maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the beach. And so it's really lovely to be able to get some nice perspective, some fresh sunshine, salt air to kind of rejuvenate me and give me some really great ideas, I think, to help bolster this community and the work that we do at the university. So we're going to talk a little bit about psychological resilience. It's really an important factor when we think about veterans and we think about their mental health. It's empowering. If you have psychological resilience, you can be empowered. And it also can protect us too and help us, kind of decrease some of our symptoms or some of the thoughts and things that we're thinking about. And so we wanted to really focus on psychological resilience for this project, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the project in a few minutes. And so when veterans reintegrate, as we all know, we've heard this before, oftentimes they struggle with post-traumatic stress, anxiety, obviously resilience, also anxiety, depression, and for many it's difficult. Some people that I speak to and some of the veterans I work with don't want to reach out for help. They don't want to ask for help because of the stigma that's associated with that, that they don't want people to think that they're broken or that they're weak. And I understand that, married to a Marine. Absolutely will not, talk about certain things with me, but you kind of know, I think, as a spouse and as a loved one, when someone's having some issues, and you try to reach out and give them the best quality care that you can, but also the people that are seeking care need to want to receive that care, and I think that that's important. And it not only affects the veteran, but obviously the family, and also society as a whole. And so when we think about our mental health care providers, there's really 2 places that veterans seek care. It's at the VA or in a community or a civilian health care system. Both are difficult to navigate, especially veterans that are reintegrating into society, from active duty military. But it's really important when we think about, mental health care providers and how mental health care providers, speak to and work with the veteran community. A lot of them do not understand the military culture. And when we looked at the data, 75% of healthcare services are occurring in the community. And so what does that mean? We have civilian mental health care providers that are working with their veteran community, but maybe do not understand the culture. We also want to make sure that when we think about civilian mental health care providers, that they understand and they have some cultural competency, how to think about working with the veteran when they're reintegrating into civilian life, especially if they have never served in the military or don't have any family members that served. They're really kind of green when they go in and have a conversation with a veteran. And we felt that it's very important for the civilian mental health care providers to really understand this culture. And having that basic understanding is really therapeutic, not only for the veteran, but also for the treatment outcomes. Because as we hear from veterans in our community, that a lot of times if the provider doesn't understand or asks questions that may be not appropriate, they shut down. And so how do we educate our civilian mental health care providers then to access the resources that they need to be better to help with treatment outcomes? And so that was really what guided us to our project, and it's called Operation Red, White, and Blue. And this is funded by Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And I don't know if any of you, the acronym is PCORI. And in my lab, we've been fortunate to be funded by PCORI 7-8 times. These projects are not research projects. They are community engagement projects where the veterans are a part of the team. And we talked about this yesterday with my colleague here on the panel, who is also a nurse, about the community engagement aspect. So the veterans are actively engaged in these projects from topic identification into dissemination. So it's not like the researchers are coming in and saying, okay, we have this idea, we would like you to participate as participants. We're asking them to come around the table, work with us, and come up with solutions that matter most to them. So this project, Operation Red, White, and Blue, is 24 months, and we're almost at the tail end of it. We had engaged 5 dyads, 5 veterans, and 5 community mental health care practitioners. And what we did was we paired them together, and we used a peer-to-peer approach, because peer-to-peer seems to be an approach that really resonates with the veteran community. we have them work together on small assignments over the course of the project, and then each one of the dyads rotates. So basically, each veteran and each community healthcare, mental health care provider meets each other during the project, which is a really nice opportunity to learn different styles, techniques, and communication styles. So I'm just going to click on this to show you the abstract. So you can go on PCORI's website, and it'll tell you all about the project background, the proposed solution that we were trying to solve, the objectives, the activities, and then on the bottom, they'll have information and if there's any deliverables. So if you have an opportunity to search PCORI's website, there are not a lot of veteran-specific projects, but a lot of them that are on their website come from our lab. And so I'm really proud of that, because when we first started with PCORI, you would have to list the population of interest that you were going to work with, and the veteran community wasn't one on the list. And so I raised my voice and I said, we need to add this to the list. And so now, when you go on PCORI and if you apply for one of their awards and they ask you for your population of interest, you can click on the veteran population. Let me go back to my slides. Okay. So what's the objective of Operation Red, White, and Blue? So we really wanted to build capacity. We wanted the veteran and the dyads to build knowledge and be able to have some communication competencies. So we wanted to use a co-learning approach using that peer-to-peer advantage. We wanted to equip their Operation Red, White, and Blue participants with the skills to become meaningful partners, to engage not only in finding solutions, but also as part of the research enterprise. We wanted it to be culturally congruent. We wanted it to be acceptable. We wanted it to be meaningful. We didn't want to just come in and ask veterans to spend their time with us for something that's not important to them. And that is really like the basis of what community engagement's about. And at the end of all of this, we're going to develop a research health agenda that we hope that veterans and community stakeholders and researchers can use then to develop research studies based on what veterans told us over the course of the 24 months. So some of the activities that we're doing is conducting community forums. Again, we're creating a research health agenda that will also have comparative effectiveness research questions in there, looking at, for example, and a simple example is like vaccine A versus vaccine B, which one is better under what circumstances, but we're looking at this in the situation of mental health and psychological resilience. And then we'll have a toolkit that will be published online and that will be free and accessible to anyone. And so one of the first group meetings that we had, we wanted to talk about cultural competence and about that first meet and greet. So if the veteran is there and they're meeting their community health care provider, what's some of the first things that happen when you sit down at the table? And the first thing that came up was, thank you for your service. And it was a very emotional conversation. Veterans in the group said sometimes they feel that it's appreciation, and other times it's very much of a discomfort to hear that. And a lot of my friends say that too, that it's almost just like an add-on. Oh, thank you for your service. And like, what's the meaning behind it? As I've said that before, but in my heart of hearts, I'm really meaning it. But in the conversation, which opened up our eyes immensely, for a community healthcare provider, that may be the first thing that they say to the veteran when they're meeting with them, and that may just turn the veteran off right away. And so a second thing was, don't assume PTSD with every veteran. This is what came up in our dialogue. That veterans said that don't assume that everyone has PTSD. And so a lot of the community healthcare providers, appreciated learning about this information because they don't know. They're not culturally congruent. They also said, get to know the veteran. Ask about their branch and their rank, right? Who are they? And a lot of veterans felt that they would feel more comfortable if the initial conversation was, well, what branch were you in? What was your rank? And maybe that would get the veteran to feel more comfortable that you really want to get to know who they are. And then the last tip that they gave us during this first meet and greet was, we're not entitled to hear and ask about the traumatic stories and the things. How many people have you killed? This is one of the examples. Civilians and healthcare providers don't need to know that information. And don't feel that, as a veteran, you need to share that. But as a mental health care provider, don't ask questions like that, because that will absolutely shut the veteran down. And so we have a newsletter that we wrote about this. I don't know where. maybe encrypted here, but there's a newsletter on our website, and it has all the information, and we had dialogue where veterans actually wrote columns about thank you for your service and what that meant to them. There was someone that felt comfortable with it, and then someone that felt uncomfortable with it. So, I invite you to take a look at the newsletter. It really opened up our eyes, as a civilian. And some of the outputs from our project, again, we're going to look at increasing capacity for veterans to be actively engaged in the research process, from topic identification to dissemination of the results. We want to help mental health care providers, apply the competencies that they're going to be learning, and also mobilize them to come together with veterans so they can work together as a team. The dyad is for this project. We want to keep the relationship together, and we want to keep building on what we've learned. And again, we're going to develop a toolkit that will be available, open access. So to date, we've reached about 580 community members and veterans within this project, which is amazing. That people are showing up to our community forums. They want to hear about the dyads and what they're doing, and we also want to teach other community mental health care providers about some of these cultural competencies so they can use that in their practice. And so, to achieve our goals, we want to find out what's the best way to share this information with the community health care providers and the veterans, and what are the mental health topics that are most prevalent and that require us to really look at it at a higher level of exploration. And so some of the achievements, we've gotten some good connections with nonprofit organizations in South Florida, and the Canines Providing Assistance to Wounded Warriors is actually my nonprofit, and it's all about how veterans and animals, whether it's a service dog, emotional support dog, or a companion animal, keep veterans tethered to society. We have a whole crew there at the CPAW initiative, and so feel free to explore that website. There's testimonials and videos, and it's just amazing how much a dog can make a difference. How many people have dogs in this room? Yeah. So those of you who don't have dogs, you can always, kind of look to your neighbor for a picture and take a look. But we have shown that there's biological changes when people interact with animals, and that's a whole other talk. So yeah, we've done some great work in the South Florida area, and I just want to acknowledge our funding, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, Carrie, because without them we couldn't have done it. And then here's our contact information. So I'm happy to take questions at the end, but thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was a great presentation. So last but not least, we have Rebecca Ivory from the University of Delaware. She's going to be talking about her work with Special Forces operators. Is this one here?
So everyone's here to learn about neuroscience, right? All right. So good afternoon. I am Dr. Rebecca Ivory. Please call me Rebecca. I'm here presenting partially on my doctoral work and also in conjunction with Dr. Jennifer Graber from the University of Delaware. So Special Operations Forces develop PTSD at lower rates than other groups of veterans, and their trauma presentation is very unique. And there are some really interesting reasons why this might be happening. I'm here to talk about all of this science, but I also want to facilitate a conversation about prevention. What can we learn from their very unique trauma presentation that will help all veterans? All right. So I'm a board-certified psychiatric nurse practitioner. I also have a doctorate. My doctoral work used community-based participatory research to address psychiatric care gaps among SEALs. Over about 3.5 years, I spoke to 100 current and former Navy SEALs. I treated chronic pain and trauma simultaneously using a phone app with a limited group of former SEALs and evaluated its effectiveness. We're going to see some of the results in this presentation. Now I own a business called Tactical Psychiatry, and I basically help backfill the psych needs of the community. 90% of my work is with Tier 1 operators and Navy SEALs. In the Venn diagram, they intersect. And I also work with some federal paramilitary adjacent organizations, all psych care. Also, I just want to say my actual specialty is something called operator syndrome, if any of you know what that is. But Okay, so here's a non-exhaustive list of sort of of publicly acknowledged special operations forces. I'm sorry, my slide is kind of messed up. I'm going to refer to the people who make up these special operations units as SOF. Navy SEALs are part of that. So let's get on the same page about what SEALs actually do. Right now, currently, it's pretty typical for them to deploy 4 to 5 times within about 6 years and be gone about 75% of the year, whether they are actually deploying or not. There is very little rest for this particular community of service members. In addition to routine deployments, they are also sent into combat on short notice missions. Keep all of this in mind because this is going to come up again when we talk about resiliency. Okay, so we talk about PTSD. Obviously, there's a stereotype, a stigma that all veterans have PTSD. That is not accurate, obviously, as we all know in this room. But I will tell you that diagnosing PTSD requires a very complex interplay of symptoms. And if you don't meet any one of the criteria, you don't have PTSD. It is that simple. So what we know is SOF and SEALs do not meet the avoidance criteria. That is the thing that they don't typically meet. This has been published in recent years by a number of other SOF scholars. It's also what I discovered in my own research. Here's actually my data set. We know that, yes, SEALs have trauma. Yes, SOF have trauma. Some of them have really severe trauma symptoms. When you give them like a PTSD screening tool to try to rate their symptom severity, you're going to get really high scores on it. The max score on this particular rating scale is 85. How many guys on this scale do you think actually have PTSD? 1. Only 1. The top 3 scores, they don't have any avoidance. They just score really high in other areas. So we're looking here at a piece of my data sample. Other folks who have published on this have the same findings. Okay, so let's talk about what actually improves, what might be contributing to this resilience to trauma. And I'm going to talk about 4 topics. My 5th topic, as you might note, I'm actually going to tell you what some of the SEALs who I work with actually told me. So, first possibility is what I alluded to in the actual title of this presentation. And this comes directly from my own scholarship. SEALs are trained to be innovative and problem solvers. Yes, all service members have some training about innovation, problem solving, troubleshooting to some extent. But this is a very intentional and long-term process in SEAL training to a point where it becomes second nature in their personal lives too. During my research with former SEALs, I provided psychological education, which is called psychoeducation on chronic pain. I essentially taught them how to think about their pain differently. I measured trauma and also chronic pain before and after the intervention, because neuroscience tells us that in psych settings, if we treat one of the two, it treats the other, typically. So what I discovered, I never told them to apply the chronic pain education to their trauma, but they did it anyway. And they told me in their exit interviews that they did it because in their SEAL training, they were taught just to address things. If you get a new tool, start applying it. So that's actually what they did. Not only did their pain scores decrease more than expected, but so did their trauma scores. So there's other research out there that says that there must be something in special operations training that creates resilience. I'm just saying maybe this is one of those things. No one has identified anything. A second possibility. SOF benefit from a phenomenon called learned resilience. All of us learn resilience over time. But there is a learned resiliency process that is entirely unique to special operations forces. Unlike other veterans, their total time in service plus their constant exposure to combat actually creates resilience. We're not entirely sure what the mechanism is, but it appears that this constant high tempo, high turnaround somehow actually creates a situation where they become more resilient to stress over time. One possible idea is that they're benefiting from like the iterative, the repetitive process of applying previously successful coping skills because they're in so much stress, they're just constantly, this works, so I'm applying this. Oh, this is a new thing, so I'm also going to apply this. That worked. Now I have 2 coping skills and I'm applying it again. So it sounds like it could benefit everyone, but it benefits SOF to a much greater extent than other veterans. Okay, so here's the third possibility. Now we're going to talk about the brain. There's a structure called the insula. It is on the inside of your brain. There's actually 2 of them. There's a front lobe and sort of a back lobe. In fMRI imaging, we see that SEALs have this structure activated, and most civilians do not. The only time we have civilians who have the structure activated are civilians who have experienced profound trauma and did not develop PTSD. We don't know why it turns on. There's not a ton of information. We know it happens. So what's interesting is sometimes it turns on for civilians. When we look at SEALs' brains, it's always turned on. Why is that? Can we figure out how to turn that on? So 2 things, if you know very much about trauma and how trauma works. The vagus nerve actually runs through the insula. So you might have heard that if you stimulate the vagus nerve, your trauma symptoms will decrease. It's a very direct cause and effect. It actually runs through the structure. The other thing, like I said, there's actually been some extensive studies that this really does turn on for civilians. But they really have to go through extensive trauma, but it's some of the time, maybe it turns on, but it's all the time for SEALs. So, this is the 4th option. Do resilient individuals self-select for SOF? Some academics, some people who write papers say that they do. I always thought it was a cop-out. Guess what? I asked the guys that I worked with, and they said yes. But I'm going to tell you why they said yes, because it's not in the research. So, the guys that I talked to told me that the reason they feel they self-select is because it takes so long and so much effort to get to selection, through selection, and finally to your special operations unit. You have a good idea of what you're going to be doing there. You have literally 6 or more years to get your values, your morals, all of those things in line with what you are about to undertake. They feel that they have fewer moral injuries than the rest of veterans because they have to be so intentional about doing this work. A lot of the guys I talked to were former infantry and had served and were not special operations. They talked to me about, well, when you go in the military, you don't really expect for stuff to go wrong. And it does. In special operations, it's basically all you train for. So here they are getting all of this training, all of this mental and psychological preparation to do really hard things. So when those hard things happen, they're ready for them. They expect them, they know that they're going to happen, and they're, by and large, okay with it. They also mentioned that it really has to do, like I mentioned, with this idea of realistic training. And this is something that I've brought up with a lot of people since I started talking to SEALs about this, that literally simulating certain things, I mean, we know this in psych. If you practice something over and over again when you actually do it, it's not that bad. And that's something that special operations benefit from, and most of your typical service members might not. So, why are special operations forces more resilient to trauma than other veterans? I gave you 4 ideas. The answers, we don't know. It could be any of these. It could be 100 other things. We just don't know. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that, so I do this work. I work with special operators. I love working with them. I fell into it with my doctorate. It was almost an accidental thing that I decided to do for my actual doctorate work. There's very little knowledge about veterans in their specific groups. They're based on their service. When I did my, my research study, I had, I think, 6 papers that addressed mental health since 1951 for Navy SEALs. 6. So I choose to stay in this because I'm going to contribute to this. And that's like my goal. And it's very frustrating to me. My husband is active duty. He's a fighter pilot. There's no information about any of them. So it's the same thing. And it doesn't matter. You could be infantry, you could be medic. There's just no information. And so I really hope that all of us in the health sciences who do research and do this kind of work can start breaking out veterans by group so we can learn more and we can also benefit. Veterans can benefit from each other. That's it.
Okay, folks,
that's
we're
your
going to move
first
into the
conference.
Q&A section. We've got about 15 minutes, so if you have a question, let me know. Raise your hand and introduce yourself. Who has a question?
This one's for Rebecca. Thank you very much. So I can't tell you the piece of literature I read, but in the spring, major news was SEALs had the highest suicidality that they've ever had since they started tracking at the beginning of the post 9/11 wars. What's going on if they're so resilient?
I wish. Oh. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. I wish I knew. I think they wish that they knew too. I do one-on-one and groups with guys, with operators. Everyone knows someone who's committed suicide recently. I wish I knew, and that's the start and finish of it. I wish I knew. They wish they knew. Everyone knows someone who's committed suicide recently. We don't have an answer right now. Yeah.
Other questions? I saw one in the back. Yep.
I'm Wiley Barnes from Colorado State University. My question is for Rebecca, and this is my ignorance on the insula. Is it possible that the insula is turned on because they're SEALs, or they're SEALs because the insula is turned on?
You just hit the nail on the head. We don't know. And I don't know if I explained this enough in my presentation, but what the insula really does is it actually controls our self-knowledge of the processes that are going on in our body. And because their insula is turned on to such a degree, they can control them. So imagine standing outside a house, you're about to breach the door, there's going to be a firefight, you're going to clear the house, stuff is going to go sideways, okay? These guys, whether they actually do it on purpose or not, or are thinking about it or not, they can literally control their own blood pressure. Imagine going into a chaotic event in full with order and calm inside your brain and body.
I'm Hugo. I'm a student at ASU and a veteran. My question is for William. And then I lost my train of
You have to talk really close to it.
Do you think in the course of the pandemic, before it actually hit, that a lot of veterans may have been more aware of the potential for the pandemic coming, and that was why some of them were a little bit more prepared in some ways than was anticipated?
Yes, I can only speak to the data that I have, though. So with our next step is to do follow-up interviews to ask kind of what you're alluding to, and ask questions about specifically what their readiness was, because as I said, the civilians scored higher in the second study. So in the first study, when the pandemic first hit, and we're thinking that maybe there was a spark of maybe that. What we were talking about yesterday of a feeling of purpose or a call to action or something that sparks like I can enact my military identity that I've had to restrain because we're in a disaster scenario. But then as the pandemic drug along and as it took us 6 months to get IRB approval to do study 2, then it made it where maybe during those 6 months they kind of cooled off. And so maybe that's why we see the difference between civilians and military veterans.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, good thought. It is a good thought.
Hi, this is Ben Schrader from Colorado State, and this is for anyone who wants to answer it. One of the things I've constantly struggled with is the DSM and their defining of PTSD, right? And so I guess it's how do you all gauge that? Because I know you said only one had, PTSD out of all that, which I find that hard to believe, right? And I just think that part of the big problem is how we are trying to define this dealing with trauma.
That is a great question. So yes, PTSD diagnostics is really complex. And you also have to think about sort of PTSD. It's not really a fair standard, I don't think, for veterans. So people who have experienced certain kinds of trauma are going to present differently. The reason those scores were so high is because they had really severe other trauma symptoms that gave them that high score, okay? There's something called complex PTSD that's going to probably be in the next DSM. I think they announced that. So that might be something that is a little more applicable to combat veterans. That is someone who has experienced repeated inescapable trauma, where they are not able to leave the scene of the event. That might be more accurate, and they present very differently than what we expect to see with someone who has PTSD. The good news, honestly, is that thanks to a lot of brain science, we can treat a lot of trauma symptoms individually. So in my perspective, I talk to these guys who have a lot of trauma all the time, and they might have like these very specific things, like they have nightmares, they have hyperarousal, they have very specific things. We figure out, like, do you actually want all of these things treated, or are some of them okay for you to still have? And we can choose sort of specific things to kind of figure out. But does that answer your question for the most part? What do you think? You guys, anything?
Good afternoon. I want to thank all of you for what you presented. This question is more directed towards Cheryl, and I just wanted to start out by saying that your work is pretty profound. And the reason why I bring that up is because my brother is a 13-year Army veteran, PTSD from 3 different shootings at 3 different stages of his life. It took me years after he got out of the Army to go to the VA or seek counseling, which is a thing in and of itself. When he went to the VA and he spoke to a provider, a counselor, that person reactivated, and it took years to go back. So, what you're doing is something that I feel is important, but then the other part of it is that it's just in this small space. Do you consider, or do you think, or have you worked with other colleagues or your organization to kind of help the VA hire the right kind of people that they need for these programs?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. This project is a new project for us, and we do have a good relationship with the West Palm VA, which is really close to our university, and I know the medical director, and I've been trying to
get some bridges built between the university and the VA to maybe develop a cultural competency workshop or something around this topic. And that will come out with one of our outputs for the, this Operation Red, White, and Blue. But yeah, it's really important because even though they work at the VA, that doesn't mean they understand the military culture, right? Because not all treating physicians or mental health practitioners are veterans themselves and can understand. And we've, spoke to our veterans, and they get very put off when someone says, "Oh, I understand how you feel." No, you don't. No, you don't. Even as a spouse, no, I don't. So I appreciate the question, and I'm sorry that that happened to your family member. And yeah, we can all do our little part to try to make a difference, and hopefully someone else won't have that, happen to them. So yeah, but stay tuned to the website on PCORI. It'll give you updates, and then also the CPAW webpage. We have a lot of information there too about other projects that we're working on that are similar to this. So, but thank you.
This is Nan, Faulkner University, and Cheryl, this kind of pigtails on what he just said, because your point about the entitlement to veteran trauma stories, and also because I live in kind of a rural community where they do see community providers as opposed to going to the VA specifically. But there seems to, because I work with a lot of homeless veterans and things, and that seems to be the story, that they want them just to tell their story, and it's like they just want to, and is there a way to treat it without specifically knowing that pain? Because that seems to trigger the homelessness. They don't want to go back.
You want to talk about the treatment?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. So I'm going to pass it to my colleague about treatment because we don't do treatment. My treatment is a dog.
That's a great treatment. So there's something called ART that is fabulous. It's just like something called EMDR, which is, it's EMDR. We'll just call it EMDR, which is a very good treatment for trauma. Does not work well for veterans because who wants to relive their trauma out loud, right? ART does not require the veteran to talk about their actual traumatic event at all. They don't need to share it with the therapist. They don't need to share it with anybody. And it's also really short. The improvement, it's a significant improvement after one dose, after one treatment. After 3 treatments, it's just as effective and or more effective than EMDR.
That's good.
Anybody have other questions? All right. Okay. Great. Let's keep going then. We got time.
So with these studies in PTSD, I've noticed a lot of focus on the combat side mostly, but I'm curious about where the field is wanting to go with military sexual trauma, because that is also like a really prevalent issue, and it feels like it doesn't always get acknowledged very well.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. So in nursing, we have an academy. It's called the American Academy in Nursing, and we have a military and veteran expert panel, and I just got, I'm the chair now of that panel. And one of our areas of interest that we want to explore with policy change, because it has a lot to do, it ties right into policy, is military sexual trauma, because we know that it's understudied. And it was something that I was interested personally in looking into a little bit more, and I'm still kind of thinking about the different ways that we can do that. We have a new faculty member at our university who is Air Force Colonel retired, and she works with women's health. And so she and I are kind of looking at military sexual trauma and what type of work that we can do that wouldn't, like we were saying, have the veteran relive the experience, but really learning what do we need to know to help you or them, right? What do we need to know in order to make it better? And I always go back to PCORI because that's my way of knowing, is to ask the population that we're trying to serve. And so if we get the information directly from the veterans who experience military sexual trauma, male and female, then we can make a difference together to look at interventions that would be supportive. So it is on my radar. It is something that's, I have my little list of things at nighttime sometimes I think about, and this is one that's been there for about a month. So I'm really thinking now that I have this new chair that I'm going to do this. So again, go on the CPAW website, keep in touch with me, send us an email. We're always looking to engage veterans in the community. Recruitment is really difficult right now for projects, but these projects are inviting people to come in as collaborators, not as participants in the study. So thank you for that.
Wiley Barnes again. So I failed to say thank you before I asked my first question. To everybody, phenomenal topics, really energizing. Happy to be here to see everybody and listen to these talks. So my question is for William, and it has to do with the resilience scores, higher in civilians versus veterans that you talked about. And as I was thinking about that, there are some differences between the civilian that you're comparing the veteran to, in that the veteran was once a civilian, they were then in the military, and then they have made a transition. That transition, once they've left the service, they lack the same type of organizational structure, kind of an intrusive leadership in all aspects of their lives, and a purpose. Their purpose is different. They also are adapting to a different language and culture in the workplace and the civilian population. Have you considered those differences when you try to understand why the scores are different? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have considered the differences, and it's something that we're working up and writing through. Again, one of them didn't make as much sense to me, the creating alternative pathways, because as we've heard, veterans have to create alternative pathways, and from the other presentations, so that's a skill that you would think you learn in the military and you're able to carry on. The one about the social networks, that wasn't too surprising to me, that veterans reported smaller social networks than civilians. But what I am doing is, like I said earlier, going back and doing qualitative analysis, and so doing some in-depth interviews with veterans about and seeing if I can pull out some of the specific reasons why what they felt at the beginning of the pandemic and what they felt 6 months to a year in, and how that may have changed. And again, maybe they got that sense of purpose and they got that boost initially, and then after 6 months it started to dissipate they realized that they weren't going to be able to, like I said, use my go bag or something like that, that I wasn't going to be able to do that. It wasn't that type of scenario. So, yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question. Ben again. This is for William, and then maybe I just missed it, but is there an intersectional component to how you're looking at this, right? Whether it be resilience among men, women, person of color, right? Like, what is there that built within your study?
We did all of those analyses to compare the different groups, and we didn't find any significant differences. The only difference we found in the first study was that the number of months you spent in combat was related to your loneliness, but so we controlled for that as a covariate. But as far as in the resilience study, we didn't find any significant differences between any of the groups. We did those analyses.
We still have some time. Anybody have any burning questions?
Steve Wall from the University of South Carolina. Questions for Dr. Krause, but I'll take an answer from anybody who's got thoughts on it. What are some alternatives to thank you for your service?
Well, the one thing that came up, and again, I encourage you to look at the PCORI website because the newsletter's posted, and we have columns that were written by veterans looking at the ones that appreciated it and the ones that felt discomfort. And really, they wanted, in their conversations, what they felt would be better was, oh, what branch and, what was your rank? Kind of starting the conversation more about that to kind of get to know the veteran than thank you for your service. But I don't think that there's another phrase that they came up with that would be like a better phrase. They just don't want the phrase. They just want, get to know me as a person, and then I'll share with you who I am. Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, I've said it many times, and, it comes from my heart, and I feel like, but I'm not a veteran, so when I heard the discomfort, then I kind of step back, and now I don't say it anymore. Now I do ask, oh, you were in the military. What was your rank? What branch were you in? And then a conversation just kind of starts organically. I mean, obviously, if the veteran has a dog, it's much easier for me to interact with them because then we talk about the dog and then they talk about, their importance in their life. So that's always a nice, icebreaker. But yeah, they didn't come up with an alternate phrase. It's just get to know me as a person, and then I'll share with you who I am.
Yeah, I'll just say, so it kind of bothered me when I was in and when I first got out. Thank you for your service. Now I realize that it's just something people say, but when I first but one time I really appreciated it, and that was when I was at Fort Sam Houston, and I was in medic school, and I was out with my wife on the Riverwalk in San Antonio in uniform, and somebody said it to me, but then handed me a $20 bill to pay for my lunch. I really appreciated that. So if you include money with thank you for your service, and boost it up. Yeah.
That's
Okay,
great.
let's just give our presenters a round of applause.
So I wanted to ask you about this. Do you do cats? I'm sorry?